them. Great. All right, so I'd like to introduce Brian McKenna. Brian is an associate professor at the director of and is the director of the Centre for Mental Health Research at the University of Auckland, and he's going to be talking about the pending New Zealand research. Welcome, Brian.
Tuatahi e tō mātou kaumātua, tēnā koe mō tō whakatau mahana ki a mātou i te timatanga o tātou hui. E te mana o Ngāti Whātua tēnā koe, a ka tāhuria hau ki a koutou katoa, tēnā koutou. I see that I'm on the program as, I think I'm billed as the local presenter, so I'd probably better start by introducing myself. In local terms, I'm referred to as a Westie. I was watching last night Outrageous Fortunes, and I'm not your archetypal Westie by any means, but that's what you've got. You've certainly got a local. And I think really initially it's quite important that I position myself in relationship to what I think is a fairly healthy tension between the media and those that are interested in suicide prevention. As I said, I'm a researcher, but I don't have a platform in suicide research. I have a joint appointment with the University of Auckland and a clinical appointment with the Auckland Regional Forensic Psychiatry Services. There I'm their nurse consultant. And so my interests, not my interests, really my concerns around suicide relate to institutional suicide, primarily the suicide and parasuicidal behaviour of mentally unwell offenders. And I belong to a service that has an international reputation. That's the Mason Clinic. And the Mason Clinic really came out of an inquiry, that's the Mason report that occurred in 1988. And the Mason report, which led to a radical overhaul of forensic mental health services, stemmed in part from the deaths by suicide in prison of 14 people in the 1980s, whose death may have been prevented if they had been transferred from a prison into a mental health services, the then Oakley Hospital. So I'm not an expert either in terms of the media, but I am aware of some of the research which looks at the links between the media and mental health more generally than suicide. If you look at some of the studies undertaken by a colleague, Ray Nairn, Ray talked about some of the negative portrayals in the media around mental illness. Like, for instance, one of the studies talked about how people who experience mental illness are portrayed as being dangerous. But I'm also aware of the research which talks about how the media has made some positive progress in relationship to how they frame mental health issues. And that relates to the Mental Health Commission survey, which talks about progress from the survey that they undertook in the year 2000 to what was undertaken in 2005. I have been involved in a little bit of research myself in terms of the media, and that came out of a more global study where we were asked to look at the issues around the involvement of people with mental illness and homicide in the New Zealand context. Some of us may be aware that there's a myth out there, and that's the study that I'll refer to in a moment. There's a myth out there, and it's sort of around this issue of what's happened in New Zealand since deinstitutionalisation. That is the movement away with people who have mental health issues away from the large asylums and out into the community. And part of that myth is that somehow that process has fed into some of the negative trends that occur in our society, including violence, and at the severe end of violence, the issues around homicide. So we undertook a piece of research which for the Ministry of Health, where we were asked to track the involvement of people who had mental health issues in homicide over a 30-year period up until the year 2000. And what we found is this is the general trend in relationship to the rates of homicide. So there's this sort of upward trend in New Zealand that seems to plateau off somewhat towards the late 1990s and up to the year 2000. If we start to look at the involvement of people that were mentally unwell at the time of perpetrating homicide, that's mental unwellness as defined by the courts, so these people who were found to be not guilty of reasons of insanity. Over that 30-year period, we actually have this sort of fairly straight trend. There are some outliers of high numbers and low numbers, but statistically we sort of have that fairly flat line. So if you combine those two statistics, is what you find since deinstitutionalisation in New Zealand is a decrease in the proportion of people who are mentally unwell in relationship to the perpetration of homicide. So that's the evidence, and yet we have this myth out there that somehow these people are feeding into and increasing. So there's a disparity between the myth and the reality. So what we thought it might be quite interesting to do is to look at, given that the media is the window to the world, supposedly, of a lot of people out there in society and does have an influence on public perception, we thought it might be really quite interesting to see if there was the relationship between how the media presented homicide in relationship to people who were mentally unwell as opposed to homicide where mental illness was not an issue. And what we did is we looked at 10 cases over a 5-year period, and we matched those 10 cases, that was all of the incidents of people who were found not guilty for reasons of insanity, with 10 cases of other homicide where mental illness was not a factor. And we did that matching on the basis of key socio-demographic and offending variables. And what we found is when the person had a mental illness, I keep on turning to my computer because I'm so used to it, is that there was a degree of greater prominence that was given to those events in regard to the fact that they were often presented on the front page of the newspaper. They were often given a lead article status on any given page that they were presented. There was more use of alarmist type of headings, and this is an example from the Herald in February the 8th, 2000, scissor death, mother found to be insane. So there was that sort of prominence that was often given to these events. There was a tendency for the private lives of people who were mentally unwell at the time of perpetrating homicide to be given a sort of a public airing, and often there was reference to dysfunctional family upbringing, and often the private psychiatric history of people was laid open for the public to have a good gaze at. And it was interesting that some of the early diagnoses had no relationship whatsoever to the mental health issues that were present at the time of the index offence, which we found was quite interesting. There was more use of photos in relationship to events where the person had an identifiable mental illness. And these are some examples of grieving relatives at the time of the homicide. The tranquility of the locality prior to the homicide occurring. For those of you that know local history, this is Raurimu as an example. So in terms of the conclusion from this study, which as I said is a little bit away from homicide, is that there certainly was a difference in the way that the events were depicted. Now, the research didn't look at the impact that that difference had on the general public, but I think it was fairly fair for us to speculate that somehow that may have had some kind of impact on the public psyche and maybe helped to etch those events in the public memory. So in terms of suicide, I think it's, when I look at the evidence, and I've had a good scan of the evidence that Jane presented earlier on, is that in my mind there does seem to be a relationship between the way that suicide is prevented and the way that suicide is presented and the potential for a vulnerable group of people in society to pick up on that presentation. And I personally feel on the basis, and you'll have to make up your own minds, I suppose, in terms of your own journey and looking at some of that literature, is that I thought it was actually quite prudent that the Ministry of Health did lay out some best practice sort of guidelines to assist in the reporting of these sorts of events. So that was my perspective. But of course you've got the studies like the Tully and Elsaka study, which indicated that when those guidelines are presented to the media, the research that Jim did talked about the extent to which senior journalists and editors tended to ignore the resource and start to perceive it maybe as an impingement on their basic right to freedom of expression. So that sort of debate aside, it's really quite interesting that in New Zealand, Jane talked about that there is a baseline determination of what suicide is presented in the media and the quality of that presentation, yet we have no baseline in New Zealand. So, TPO, through the Ministry of Health, has been looking at a research project which attempts to establish that particular baseline. So the aims of this research, which a team of us has been commissioned to look at, is to investigate the nature of reporting and portrayal of suicide in non-fiction media. So what I mean by media is newspapers, television, radio, and a little bit of a gaze into news websites on the internet. So that's the sort of scope of the media that we'll be looking at. And it's lovely as a researcher not to have to start from scratch, because there's an incredibly well-designed research been undertaken by Jane in Australia. So what we were asked to do mirrors to a large extent the research that was done in Australia, but it adds in this dimension of having a little bit of a look at the internet, and it adds in the unique dimension that belongs to our context here in New Zealand, and specifically tries to address some of the issues for Pacific Island groups and Maori, given the overrepresentation of those groups in the statistics, etc. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the media depictions over 12 months, and we're going to use well-known and recognised search terms to find out where those items are in the media that we source. We're going to add to those search terms Maori-specific terms and Pacific Island language-specific terms, because we're not looking at media depictions in Maori language or Pacific Island nations' languages, but we're looking at the representation of those issues in English that may be presented to specific Maori and Pacific Island communities as well. Though we are going to look at Maori news presentations and current affairs with Pacific Island themes, because often if they're using the language, there are captions, of course, and we'll be looking specifically at the captions for reference to the words that we'll be searching for. We're employing an external company, the same company that was used in Australia, to screen and find those articles for us, and then we will go as a research team through initial screening process to see if we include those articles into the study. We will then do a rich sort of, I won't go into the detail here, but we'll do a rich description of the sorts of events that occur and put them into a tabulated form on our database spreadsheets. And then from that, we will do a quality check of 10% of those items. So for each of the categories of newspaper, television, radio, internet, we'll do this quality screening of 10%. And we'll base that quality determination similar to what Jane described in the Australian study, that we'll try to come up with a scale with a number, and in terms of creating that scale, we'll be looking closely at the work that was done in Australia, the resource kit that's come out from the ministry, and of course the Coroner's Act, to come up with those quality indicators that are being used or not. What that will aid is some kind of hopefully binary determination of what is good and what is not so good, a little bit in terms hopefully of what the graph setup that Jane presented earlier on, to give us some indication of the quality of what's been presented in our media. We're also going to do a more in-depth framing analysis. We don't know what these topics are, but I'll allude to some at the end of the study, which will enable us to do a more in-depth quality analysis of the way that certain issues that are prominent in the media are depicted. So we'll be looking at the sorts of words that use, sentence structure, the way that the stories are constructed, where they are in the newspaper, how they're padded in terms of the other articles that exist around them, those sorts of things. We'll be using computerised sort of equipment to assist both in the quantitative analysis that come up with in terms of using SPSS and in vivo for the more qualitative analysis. And the sample that we're going to use answers some of Jim's queries, I suppose, around newspapers, for example. We're going to 262 media sources for our information. The majority of those clearly are newspapers, and as Jim alluded to, there's a whole lot of little community papers out there which media monitors are able to get hold and scan on our behalf. So we're looking at 186 of those. We're looking at 18 radio stations. We look at 9 free-to-air and paid networks in regards to television, including the news and current affairs. That's the news and current affairs shows on those stations, and that includes Maori television. We're going to the internet, and we're specifically looking at 49 news sites. So those are the news sites of newspapers, because often what they're reporting on the news site is different to how the reports that appear in the paper. And we're also going to some independent news-specific sites like newswire.com and Scoop. I've talked a little bit about that I don't have a huge research platform in suicide, but those sorts of strengths are included in the team that I work with. For this sort of research, you need multiple gazes looking at the material, so we've made sure that we've got together a multidisciplinary team to undertake this research. So there's myself and Tony O'Brien, who's a colleague, a senior lecturer up at the university. We've got a sociologist who is our research fellow, Katie Tom. We've got Dr. Ray Nean. Ray has had a lot of experience in terms of analysing the media, and Ray has also got a psychology background. Gareth Edwards is a service user academic who runs his own private research company. And in terms of a journalist expertise there, we've got Ingrid Leary as part of our research team. We've also set up an expert reference group of people who we are accountable to in terms of what we're doing and how we're doing it on a regular basis. And that consists of Dr. Simon Hatcher, who's a psychiatrist, and Simon does have a major platform in suicide research. We've got Atasuma, who is Samoan and is a researcher with a research group out at Waitemata District Health Board. And we've got Dr. Terry Ann Clark, who is Maori and has research interest specifically in Maori youth suicide, and her PhD was in that area. We'll be reporting back on this research in October next year. Just to give you a quick snapshot of the first month of data collection, we came up with over 200 items in our scan of the media. 134 of those were from the newspaper, 41 from the internet, 22 from the radio, and 7 from the television. And what we're doing now is we're extracting all that descriptive data, and we've got most of that onto our spreadsheets. We haven't done the qualitative analysis, the quality analysis to date. There's 2 potential framing themes that have tended to come up, sort of areas of interest that we think we might be able to do a more in-depth quality analysis in regard to. One is murder-suicide. There was quite a bit of media representation of 2 events that occurred in July in New Zealand. The other issue that we think is coming up, which may be an issue that we can have a closer look at, is youth suicide issues, specifically technology and the use of new technology. There was a big conference down in the South Island around net safety, and that got a lot of exposure in the newspapers, etc. And the other issue is that of text bullying. So at 3 months, we started the collection of the data in July. In 3 months' time, we'll make some decisions about, there's 5 cases we're going to look at, and hopefully we'll be launching into 2 or 3 of those at that stage. There's another issue that you're all probably aware of that has occurred very recently around celebrity involvement in some of these sort of issues, and that may come up as another issue that may be worthy of this more in-depth analysis. So that's basically it. It's exciting to be part of a process like this. It's very early days. We're excited about what we're doing, the process that we're involved in, and hopefully in a year's time or so we'll be back in a forum similar to this, presenting some results for those of you that are interested. Thanks very much.
Wow, that's wonderful. And I'm just thinking October is when your findings are due out. I wonder if we can get a sneak preview at next year's conference in September. Maybe. We'll work on that. Thank you, Brian. I think it's probably best just to move into the forum, and then you can ask Brian some questions there. So I'm going to introduce or get Merrin to come up, and she's going to chair now an open forum. So